by welcoming Adrian Arst, who's here, the founder of the Adrian Arst Latin America Center. Adrian could not make it to all of our events, but we're so delighted, Adrian, that you can be here today. As all of you know, Adrian is a force and the visionary behind all the work that we do as a center. I'd also like to recognize and thank President Sergio Segovia and our colleagues at the Brazilian Trade and Investment Promotion Agency for their support of this initiative. I'd like to also welcome Acting Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, Joseph Semsar, as well as Ambassador Nestor Forster, who has been appointed to represent Brazil here in the United States, as well as Congressman Ray Lahood, who is joining us and taking time from his busy schedule on the Hill. For over a year, the Adrian Arst Latin America Center, we've been working with partners, both here in the United States as well as in Brazil, to put forward new ideas to advance a more robust commercial relationship. And this is, for us, strategically important, this deeper relationship. The United States is Brazil's, as many of you know, second largest trading partner. I think we want to make that number one. And Brazil, as Latin America's largest democracy and economy, is one of the U.S.'s top 15 global trading partners. I think we also want to make that much higher as well. Our aspiration that the ideas we're releasing today, put together in consultation with policymakers from both the U.S. and Brazil and private sector leaders, that they help to really accelerate a strengthening of this commercial partnership. And this is critical at this moment as the relationship brings such enormous potential. Today's event also serves as the launch of the U.S.-Brazil Trade and FDI Enhancing the Bilateral Economic Relationship, a report that many of you got on the way in, which is co-authored by Ken Hyatt, Brown Netto, Elisa Schindler, who are all here with us today and all will be speaking as part of today's discussion, as well as Danielle Godinho, who is not here today. Before I pass the floor to Sergio Segovia, I'd like to remind those who are following via webcast or who are tweeting during today's event, please do so using the hashtag ACBrazil. Now I'd like to welcome President Sergio Segovia to the stage. Sergio Segovia was appointed by President Bolsonaro to lead the Brazilian Trade and Investment Promotion Agency in its mission to really promote Brazilian products and services abroad and also to attract foreign investment strategic sectors of the Brazilian economy. He has a long background prior to that, including working in everything from military and management and government affairs to emergency and risk management. He's also a Rear Admiral. So Rear Admiral Segovia, welcome to the Atlantic Council. We'll look forward to your comments. Please welcome the stage.
Okay. Good morning. Sorry. This is difficult. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to extend special greetings to Ms. Adrian Arst, the founder of the Atlantic Council, to the Ambassador of Brazil, Nestor Forster, and Mr. Fred Kemp, CEO of the Atlantic Council, who opens his home to welcome us today. Both institutions were crucial at all stages of this initiative. I also greet everyone here. Thank you for the presence of the Secretary Joe Samsar. I can see him here now. Okay. From the U.S. Department of Commerce and his team, Mr. Brown Netto, Mr. Ken Hyatt, and Ms. Elisa Schindler here today, and Danielle Godinho, authors of this important report. Ambassador Pedro Miguel da Costa Silva. And bringing an optimistic message, willing to work together. Being in the United States is always a pleasure. And I want to stress that we are honored to participate in a meeting that has as main motivation the launch of the US-Brazil Trade and FDI report, Enhancing the Bilateral Economic Relationship, a highly relevant publication created by notorious experts from the private sector, which will serve as a work input for governments and also for the Brazilian Trade and Investment Promotion Agency, Apex Brazil. There is an incredible potential to deepen collaboration and explore the next steps to strengthen the U.S.-Brazil trade and investment. The U.S. and Brazil are important partners and allies. Apex Brazil wants to be actively involved in this process, offering the best of its expertise regarding export promotion, internationalization of companies, and investment attraction. I would like to draw attention to 3 points. First, I would like to introduce the agency and its role and mission. Next, I will highlight some points of the report produced by the authors. Finally, I would like to remind you the other efforts that we are making in order to write a new chapter in the bilateral relationship with the US. For such, it is essential that we have business intelligence tools, new partnerships, joint events, exchange of best practices, and all kinds of high-quality tools, so that in a rational and consistent way, we can take full advantage of the opportunities for joint growth. About the first point, Apex Brazil is currently linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which allows for constant coordination in the joint promotion of Brazilian products and services abroad. In 2019, we carried out 436 joint actions in 89 countries. Compared to 2018, we had an increase of 56% with a prominent presence in strategic markets such as the United States. Within the 53 export projects we currently carry at Apex Brazil, 41 have the United States as their target market. Along more than 20 years of activities, Apex Brazil remains committed to the Brazilian productive sector. In the last 5 years, we have worked side by side with more than 100 industry associations. That way, we reached almost 30,000 companies, mainly small and medium ones. We are proud to state that, thanks to our partnerships and programs, we have achieved a very expressive participation in the total amount of Brazilian exports. In 2019, 4,200 companies, among the more than 14,000 we supported throughout the year, made direct sales of goods abroad, accounting for $68.1 billion US dollars, or 30.2% of all Brazil sold to other countries. Regarding the internationalization of companies, I can mention that in 2019, Apex Brazil promoted, through its offices, the soft landing of more than 100 Brazilian companies in foreign markets, helping to ensure the infrastructure and services for local and virtual installation abroad. In 2019, Apex Brazil facilitated the attraction of investments with around 1.85 billion US dollars in investments announced. Today, undoubtedly, the international community recognizes the effort Brazil has made to improve its business environment and gives due credit to initiatives such as the efficient privatization program conducted by the federal government and its effects to leverage the economy with a strong offer in investment opportunities. Apex Brazil carefully follows all these developments, strengthening the area of intelligence and the partnerships that have emerged with relevant players, such as the Atlantic Council, which today gathers a qualified audience for the launch of a new and important work. New lights are shed on the challenges that involve the current stage of approximation between two large nations. I'm confident in our ability to move forward. Regarding the second point, we understand that the report has a great value precisely because it was made independently, reflecting a vision from the private sector and from people who have already passed through the government of both countries. We believe that the recommendations that are made at the end of the study to improve bilateral economic relations are valid and have a great potential for implementation. The report does not just suggest a free trade agreement for the future, but it creates a strategy to pave the way for this agreement. A multi-chapter trade enhancement agreement, for example, if it's the path chosen by the government, would have relevant economic value for both parties. It would create a set of rules and commitments that would facilitate and promote bilateral trade. It would provide predictability and legal certainty that would increase two-way investments, and it would serve as a basis for a possible free trade agreement in the long term. In addition, the report has the merit to point out the current stage of the proposed measures, in which we have already achieved concrete progress, such as the improvement of best regulatory practices, the coordination of efforts for Brazil's entry into the OECD, the advancement of negotiations for a mutual recognition agreement of authorized economic operators. Apex Brazil supported this study in order to contribute with the governments of both countries by analyzing the scenario and propose concrete short and long-term solutions. I would like to finish with the third point, recalling that in 2018, two other publications of Apex Brazil contributed to a better understanding of Brazil-United States relations. We had the bilateral investment map, and later we also published the map of Brazilian exports to US, based on the regional vision provided by the US Bureau of Economic Analysis. It was an opportunity to significantly improve our understanding of the diversity and peculiarities of each US region. In the context of our affiliation with the Atlantic Council, we have promoted two roundtables here in Washington, both of high importance for understanding the current scenarios involving Brazil and the United States. I cannot miss the opportunity to also mention the launch of Spotlight, 5 key economic avenues for strengthening US-Brazil trade and FDI, a publication that came to outline 5 main approaches for Brazil and the United States to work effectively in their common interests. Later, in October, we had the first roundtable with the Atlantic Council in Brazil during the last edition of the Brazil Investment Forum. Many previous steps have brought us to today's meeting, in which we are pleased to confirm the value of the partnership with the Atlantic Council and the interest in Brazil. Along with the technical staff of Apex Brazil, we are at your disposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Segovia. I'd now like to introduce Joe Semsar. Joe is the Acting Undersecretary for International Trade at the International Trade Administration, and I was joking with Joe beforehand, before going through the rest of your bio, I'll say is a huge advocate for Brazil relations and for really deepening the U.S.-Brazil partnership. In addition to that, he also coordinates all issues concerning international trade policy and promotion, trade law enforcement, trade agreement compliance, investment, global competitiveness, directs the trade policy recommendations and positions. He previously served as Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary of Commerce and is also, in May, will be chairing the U.S.-Brazil Commercial Dialogue. So, Joe, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. We look forward to continuing working with you and to your comments. Please welcome Undersecretary Semsar.
I always have to raise this thing up a few inches. Well, thank you, Jason. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this important event today and for the opportunity to discuss this exciting time in U.S.-Brazil economic relations. We just had a breakfast, and one of the things that came up was just this moment of time. And one of the things that I compared it to was when you're thinking about American government and governance and politics, one thing that you always hear is the big mo. Which is the big momentum. And what I would say is it feels like there is some momentum behind this bilateral relationship, and we look forward to leveraging this report as a focusing document to move that relationship forward. To all the government officials, organizations, and companies here today, many of which were at that breakfast this morning, it's a pleasure to be with you. As the Acting Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, like Jason mentioned, I lead the International Trade Administration housed at the Department of Commerce under the leadership of Secretary Wilbur Ross. And you mentioned the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is also housed at the Department of Commerce. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, has been doing a lot of work on the U.S.-Brazilian trade and relationship front. And there's a number of other bureaus at the Department of Commerce that are also engaged in this relationship, such as the Patent and Trademark Office and many, many others. ITA, the International Trade Administration, and our Brazilian counterparts have worked together for many years to prevent, reduce, and remove barriers to bilateral trade. We have prioritized cross-cutting issues, including trade facilitation, good regulatory practices, standards and conformity assessment, digital and intellectual property, and business ethics. These issues are important to our industries and are areas where we can make concrete and meaningful progress in the short and long term. A few weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to preview the recommendations in the Atlantic Council's report titled U.S.-Brazil Trade and FDI, Enhancing the Bilateral Economic Relationship. The report is both extensive and ambitious, and I appreciate the practical nature of the recommendations for achieving our mutual goals of increasing bilateral trade. Before I got out of the breakfast, I pledged to personally share this report with a number of U.S. officials that are advocates for this bilateral relationship, and to personally put it on the desk of my secretary, Secretary Ross. I think it's worth noting that it was not easy to get where we are today. But through years of engagement under our bilateral mechanisms, such as the U.S.-Brazil Commercial Dialogue, we have been able to have productive and meaningful discussions. Before I continue, I want to specifically thank all former co-chairs of the U.S.-Brazil Commercial Dialogue, especially Ken Hyatt and Abrao Neto, who are here today. In addition to the work under the U.S.-Brazil Commercial Dialogue, work has also taken place under the USTR-led Agreement on Trade and Economic Cooperation, or ATEC. In D.C., as many of you know, everything has to have an acronym. Strong and ongoing coordination between the commercial dialogue and the ATEC is key to any progress towards future trade agreement discussions. At ITA, we are working closely with USTR to ensure work under the commercial dialogue complements and supports work done in the ATEC. And we are especially pleased at the good progress being made on trade facilitation and good regulatory practices. We remain committed to working through our bilateral constructs to build mutual understanding, acceptance, capacity, and to implement important trade reforms in support of future trade agreement discussions. In addition to these ongoing government-to-government engagements, there are countless opportunities to grow our bilateral trade. One of our priorities is to increase U.S. participation in Brazil's infrastructure sector. Brazil has a confirmed pipeline of federal projects valued at $1 billion for ports, $14 billion in rail, $2.5 billion in airports, and $36 billion in highways. To promote these opportunities to U.S. companies, the Commerce Department recently created a new Deal Teams initiative. Deal Teams have been a part of the Western Hemisphere, and Brazil for many years. Deal Teams work to identify potential projects early in the development process and ensure a whole-of-government approach to supporting U.S. companies interested in potential projects. Deal Teams bring together the resources of multiple U.S. government agencies such as the State Department, USTDA, XM, and the new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. And just as an anecdote, we recently took these deal teams that for years have been at the country level to a global scale. We met at the State Department. We had the leads for many of these organizations that I just mentioned, thinking about how can we best work together to support U.S. industry and in their pursuits of some of these governmental projects. In fiscal year 2019, the Department of Commerce led Deal Teams in the Western Hemisphere helped close approximately $4.7 billion in deals. Recently, the Department of Commerce rolled out another initiative to catalyze U.S. private investment in infrastructure and energy projects in the region called America Crece. Recently, I was having a conversation with the secretary, and he said, "Joe, how exactly do we pronounce this?" It's America Crece. And actually, he's gearing up for an appropriations hearing later this morning where we are hoping that we can speak on this initiative. U.S. companies are only involved in 2% of infrastructure construction projects in Latin America. In comparison, companies from Spain are involved in 19% of construction projects, followed by China at 7%. America Crece taps into the program's resources and expertise of numerous U.S. government agencies to help secure financing, assess and mitigate risk, and strengthen regulatory environments for investors so that U.S. companies are better positioned to participate in these opportunities. The success of these engagements and the launch of these programs are just a few examples of the current positive momentum behind the U.S.-Brazil relationship. You have likely heard many times, and you'll probably hear it again today, but there's a general sentiment that we need to take advantage of this unique period in the U.S.-Brazil relationship. And it's hard to disagree with that, and I hope our colleagues in both governments are prepared to take the necessary steps to do so. But we should also not lose sight of the important role that concrete technical movement plays in making this possible. If this were easy, we would have done it a long time ago. The path ahead will be complex, and we will need to get it right. And as many of you know, this is an administration and a President Trump, who has prioritized free, fair, and reciprocal trade. And I think as you unpack that, what's important to note is that this is grounded in belief that the details matter. There are fundamental issues that we need to work through before an agreement could be possible. Technical and important issues like customs, de minimis for express delivery, and the recognition of all relevant international standards developed through an open, transparent, and consensus-based process, including standards developed by U.S. domiciled standards development organizations. In the meantime, I and my team at Commerce will continue to build the foundations for a potential trade agreement. Over the next few months, we have several bilateral engagements planned. We are very much looking forward to accepting your president here in the U.S. down in Miami later this week. Next week, we will host the working level meetings of the U.S.-Brazil Defense Industry Dialogue, or DID. I was told it's not DID, it's DID. The DID has 4 working groups across government and industry that collaborate on everything from cybersecurity best practices to identifying partnerships in space commerce. In late March, Brazil and the United States will bring together stakeholders to identify how we can streamline our conformity assessment procedures. This May, I'm looking forward to co-chairing the 18th plenary of the U.S.-Brazil Commercial Dialogue right here in Washington, D.C. And early this summer, Secretary Ross will co-chair the 11th meeting of the U.S.-Brazil CEO Forum. The last time we did that was November. These ongoing engagements and discussions are essential to advancing the U.S.-Brazil bilateral relationship, deepening our economic ties, and laying the necessary groundwork for any future trade agreement discussions. In closing, I want to say 2 words. Thank you for your dedication. Well, thank you. Thank you for your dedication to the important work being done on the U.S.-Brazil bilateral trade relationship. We have our work cut out for us, but most importantly, we need your help. Everyone in this room can contribute, and as Jason said, if we can take the talents of the talents and the access and the institutional knowledge of the folks that are in this room and apply them to moving this focusing document forward, we can make some good progress. I look forward to the future and continued collaboration between the International Trade Administration, our Brazilian counterparts, the Atlantic Council, and industry to help us prioritize issues, provide technical expertise, and to push both of our governments to do the hard work necessary to make meaningful progress. So with that, I'll end with those 2 words I just talked about. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thanks,
I'd now like to welcome Representative Darren Lahood to the stage to join me in a conversation. Please, Congressman. Congressman, it's a real pleasure to be joined with you on stage for a number of reasons. One of which I'm also originally from Illinois, although a little bit north of your district, the 18th congressional district outside Chicago. But great to be joined with you on stage. Congressman Lahood, as many of you know, serves on the House Ways and Means Committee. He also serves on the Joint Economic Committee. He is a co-chair of the very important US-Brazil Congressional Caucus. In addition to that caucus, also serves on the Digital Trade Caucus, among the many things that I'm sure occupies more than 24 hours in a day for you. So Congressman Hood, thank you so much for coming. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Jason. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for having me here today, and thank all of you for being here today, for your commitment and dedication to the U.S.-Brazil relationship and that continued dialogue that we're going to have and hopefully reaching a trade agreement with Brazil. And so it's a pleasure for me to be here today. And I want to thank Adrian, I think left, but thank her for her work here at the Atlantic Council, and happy to be here today. As Jason mentioned, I represent a district, Central Illinois. Our district is the 8th largest in the country in terms of corn and soybean production. So we have some of the most fertile farmland in the entire world. Ship a lot of that all around the world. We also have the largest concentration of Caterpillar workers anywhere in the world. We produce a lot of D10 tractors and excavators and mining equipment in my district, and John Deere is located right outside of my district. So trade is very important. In Illinois, Brazil is our 4th largest trading partner, and so that relationship moving forward is significant. And so our U.S.-Brazil caucus that I chair with Congressman Meeks of New York, he's a Democrat, I'm a Republican. We have about 23 members of the caucus in the Congress that focus on the relationship with Brazil in working towards a free trade agreement. And so we have members on there, Republicans and Democrats, that come from areas that represent Brazilian populations or have an interest in the relationship long term. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I should also say on the Ways and Means Committee, which of course has jurisdiction over all trade agreements in the House, over the past 2 years here, I have been part of the President's working group on USMCA, which of course we got across the finish line, and then also worked on the Phase 1 deal with China. So trade is vitally important, obviously, to the country. And as we look at the U.S.-Brazil relationship and moving forward, I look forward to your input, the dialogue that we're going to have, and how we can be helpful. I should also mention, too, I'm also the co-chair of the U.S. Soccer Caucus, which is important to Brazil.
All right.
So I have 8 colleges and universities in my district with men's and women's soccer, and it's a vital sport to our district.
So we'll have you over when we're doing a World Cup viewing party here as
do it.
well.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about the relationship, but let me first start. You're mentioning how important agriculture is to your district, and I've had the pleasure of spending some time driving at least through your district in the past. You mentioned agriculture, John Deere, others. What do you see? What could be some of the potential catalytic effects, both for your district, but also for similar districts like yours around the country, where agriculture plays such an important role? What could be some of the real opportunities that could be achieved with a trade agreement with the two countries?
Well, I think a couple things. Logistically, in a district like mine, or if you look at the upper Midwest, you look at the inland waterway system, and most of the products that I mentioned, corn, soybeans, ethanol, Caterpillar, John Deere products, let's not forget the Mississippi River is the western part of my district, but how much product gets put on those barges, goes down to New Orleans, gets offloaded, and can quickly get to Brazil, right? That is a transportation route that is very accessible, and to this day, I don't think there's a more efficient, effective, or accountable way to ship product than through the inland waterway system in the upper Midwest. And so when you think about the Illinois River and the Mississippi River and the tributaries that feed in there, it's vital to getting products to Brazil and to other areas all around the world. So that is important, I think, from a Midwestern standpoint, and again, the relationship with Brazil.
Now, Congressman, we see that today, I think, frankly, that the U.S.-Brazil relationship is more aligned than probably at any point in recent history. How do you see this momentum playing out insofar as being able to really strengthen the relationship at this critical moment? How do you see this as different than in the past, and what kind of opportunities do you think that presents?
Well, I think politically, I think the governments are much more aligned than they have been in the past. I think with the election of President Bolsonaro in Brazil and President Trump, they have a good working relationship. That's evident from seeing them around each other, their engagement, their dialogue, and I think that has spurred where we're at today. And it was talked about earlier, the momentum, and I think we're seeing that partly because the government's aligning there, and a recognition between the both that economics can help both countries, right? I mean, Brazil's the largest country in the southern hemisphere. We're the largest economy in the northern hemisphere, and that relationship is important. And I think also the acknowledgement, and by the way, we signed a letter last year, Congressman Meeks and I, to hopefully have Brazil ascend into the OECD, which is going to be an important part of this. But I think there is movement in Congress now. The one thing that I think USMCA did is it showed our allies around the world we can negotiate a trade agreement. We can sit down with Canada and Mexico and put together a trade agreement. We've done that with China now. We've done that with Japan. So these 3 trading agreements with 4 countries that was done over the last 3 months shows the world we can do that. But I think it sets the standard for what we need to do and the benchmark for Brazil. I would just, so I think that alignment has gotten much, much closer. And obviously the role that business plays in that is significant. The Atlantic Council and other outside groups is very, very important. But there is an alignment of our 2 governments that I think is important, particularly in South America where other countries are going the opposite direction. I don't think that can be stated enough, because that is an interest of the United States, that we align with Bolsonaro and what he's doing there. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. There are a number of things that have to be met, I think, before we get to this next step. Obviously on tax reform, that is constantly an issue that I think the Ways and Means Committee is going to look at, what Brazil needs to do on tax reform, pension reform, and always corruption. Corruption, obviously, I think the new government is doing a good job of addressing that. But those are going to be, I think, 3 areas that I think that alignment will get much better as those things happen internally in Brazil. And Congressman, you mentioned OECD session, and that's one of the recommendations in this report, is really helping to galvanize and push for Brazil's OECD session. Within all these different priorities, what do you see as the role of Congress? What do you see as the role of Congress, given the momentum that you're talking about, given this pivotal opportunity, given the alignment? How can Congress help push for a stronger relationship? Well, first of all, I think we have to acknowledge the importance of Brazil and what that means to the country, right? I think obviously when we looked at USMCA, we had NAFTA from 30 years ago. We built upon that. People can see that relationship. But I think it's going to be incumbent upon the business community, people that have an interest in Brazil, to engage with Congress on the importance of Brazil and what that means. I talked about what it means to my particular district, but I think Brazil has a story to tell with every congressional district and across the country. And as it continues to grow and prosper and do well, that narrative, I think, has to be expressed to Congress. So I think there's work to be done there, right? Obviously, we know the relationship with China and the importance there. Brazil definitely plays a role with the importance and the relationship, but I think it's going to be incumbent upon us. And I think you'll see as we move down this track of a proposed free trade agreement, I think the Ways and Means Committee will have a number of hearings. Obviously, an engagement of Bob Lighthizer and his team, which I would also say none of the trade agreements that I mentioned would have happened without Bob Lighthizer. We could not ask for a more capable, smart, bright trade negotiator who understands the world, and he understands the important relationship with Brazil also. But the engagement and highlighting that, and I think the Ways and Means Committee, as we continue to go down this path, will do that through a number of hearings. And picking up on that, when you look at there's many priorities, of course, for the Ways and Means Committee outside of Brazil. How does Brazil fit into the priorities for the committee, and also what could you see as some of the steps ahead for the committee's work on trying to accelerate that trade relationship? Well, I think if you look at the 24 chapters that were negotiated in USMCA, there's, again, I think there are many of those that are the benchmark for moving forward with future trade agreements, particularly on digital intellectual property, those things which I think are a good benchmark. Next on the horizon will be a trade agreement with England after Brexit. I think we'll see the formulation of that here in the next several months. But again, that will be another step in the direction of and as we look ahead, we'll probably have a small trade agreement with India, but everybody talks about Brazil in the conversation of England, India, Brazil. And so, again, I think that's incumbent upon folks in Brazil to look at this is a real opportunity if things are done internally in Brazil. Yeah. And that's really the message that I think most of us on the Ways and Means Committee and others are pushing is we are moving in the right direction, but it'll take some internal things in Brazil to get done to get to that next level. And I think you've seen that with the prior trade agreements. Obviously, we were waiting for Brexit to be finalized, and now you're seeing that happen with England. And I think we'll be waiting for other triggering events in Brazil to happen.
And kind of pick up on the point, what type of triggering events would the Ways and Means Committee potentially be looking for?
Well, I think the specifics as it relates to tax reform, right? What that means, the double taxation issue, I know is something that people are looking at. And when you engage with the business community, particularly international companies that do business in Brazil, resolving that internally, I think, is a precursor to engaging in a trade agreement. We're not going to be able to get to the details of a trade agreement until that's resolved internally in Brazil. And I know from talking to the ambassador and others in Brazil that is at the top of their list, and I know they're working through those things. Pension reform is another part of that I think will relate to that, and the efforts as it relates to corruption. But the potential is tremendous, and I think that is not lost on the Ways and Means Committee if a number of these things are done.
And as we look ahead to the rest of 2020, what do you see as some of the steps that both countries could take and potentially even achieve in this year?
Well, the first thing is we are doing, it hasn't been announced yet, but we're going to do a US-Brazil caucus trip to Brazil.
Oh, fantastic.
So we're planning to do that hopefully in early May with Congressman Meeks and myself and a number of other members that I think will be, instructive for us and lay the groundwork for what we need to be doing on the Ways and Means Committee. We look forward to hopefully bringing some other members of the Ways and Means Committee. So that type of dialogue, that discussion, being part of or being chair or co-chair of the working group, we meet with every Brazilian group that comes to the United States, and the ambassador has been very, very good on that. So that continued dialogue and discussion is important as we move forward. So those interactions, and I know there'll be other trips going from congressional delegations also. So I think that will be a big part of it. And then getting feedback from the ambassador and his team here on the progress that's being made in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. And just a last question. I know you have votes to get back to on the Hill, but as you look at the potential sustainability of the relationship right now, your start at Congress, we started your comments saying that we've never seen the relationship as strong now as in recent history. How do we achieve sustainability so that the relationship continues to be this strong for years to come?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think meeting the benchmarks that we've set out, meeting the kind of goals that we've put in place is going to be important. And again, I think also the relationship between the President Bolsonaro and President Trump, that continued relationship is going to be very, very important and how that moves forward. But I think what we'll be looking for is goals being met, some of those threshold requirements that there's expectations here that'll be met, and I know the administration is looking at that, to see that progress is being made internally in Brazil. I think will pay the best dividends down the road and lay the narrative for what eventually will be a free trade agreement.
Well, fantastic. Well, Congressman Lahood, thank you so much for all of your excellent work, co-chair of the Brazil caucus, all the excellent work that you do alongside Congressman Meeks on the Hill, and we'll look forward to more work as leading up to your now announced trip to Brazil in early May. Ambassador Forster is going to speak after you, so we'll look forward to his comments after yours. And again, thank you for all your work, and look forward to continuing work together.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Thank you very
Good
much.
stuff.
Thank you
Yeah, thanks.
Well, it's my pleasure to now welcome to the stage Ambassador Nestor Forster. Ambassador Forster has served a long, distinguished career. He is the appointed ambassador here in Washington. As I've said to him in the past in private, look forward to removing the appointed and calling him the full ambassador here in Washington, which will hopefully happen very soon. He's a career diplomat who served in Canada, Costa Rica, and the United States. He's posted 3 times to the embassy in Washington, as well as Brazil's consulates in various cities across the United States. He has extensive experience on trade negotiations, intellectual property, financial policy, political affairs, and the list goes on. And I think also I will add to your bio also a very good friend of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center and the Atlantic Council. So Ambassador Forster, it's so great to have you. We look forward to working with you, myself and Roberto and the whole team moving forward. So please welcome the stage Ambassador Nestor Forster.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jason, for that introduction. Thank you, the Atlantic Council, for organizing this event and for doing this study. I want to thank Congressman Lahood, just left. Also want to thank the president of Apex Brazil, who also helped fund the study that's been released today, the US-Brazil Trade and FDI. I want to acknowledge the presence of my colleague, Ambassador Costa Silva here. Joe Samsar has left from Commerce Department. I want to thank you all for being here and for your interest in Brazil. I don't think I exaggerate when I state that we have a very unique moment in our bilateral relations. We've been hearing that from the previous speakers here today. It's been really a turning point. There's a senior officer at the State Department who recently told me that in the past, we've done more in the bilateral relations in the past 12 months than we had done in the previous 12 years. Might be a little diplomatic hyperbole in there, but if we look at what happened in just this first year of the Bolsonaro administration, we had a truly historic visit of our president here last March. And at that moment and since then, we've done lots of things. It's been mentioned here, the support that the U.S. has lent for Brazil's accession to the OECD. This is paramount to the continued process of reforms in Brazil. We also were able to sign the technological safeguards agreement, which would enable American companies to use the base at Alcântara in northeastern Brazil to launch satellites. It's perhaps the best spot in the world to do so. We also had the designation of Brazil as a major non-NATO ally. That opens up possibilities for strengthened cooperation in the defense area. We also revamped and reignited the CEO Forum. It was mentioned here before. It had been kind of dormant for previous years. We have launched a pilot program for global entry, which should facilitate the Brazilian visitors coming into the United States, not only business people, but frequent travelers in general. We have recently had beef exports in natura being reauthorized into the United States. Just a couple of things. Today in Brazil, we had yesterday and today we are having a meeting of the Bilateral Committee on Science and Technology, which had not been together for 5 years. This is a high-level meeting at the ministerial level, exploring many ways to further cooperate in science, technology, aerospace, and so on. All these didn't start last year with President Bolsonaro. Brazil and the U.S., sometimes we lose this perspective. We have with the United States the longest standing relationship we have with any country in the world. Just for 4 years away from today, we're going to celebrate the first 2 centuries of that relation, which has been marked by many moments of increased cooperation. Sometimes that has lessened, but our friendship has stood. It's an unbroken history of friendship and bilateral achievement. There's much more to be done. We have our president coming to a visit to Florida this coming weekend to participate in an investment seminar and to hold some bilateral talks in there. We expect some major things to be announced by then. The first and most important one, perhaps, is the agreement we have on defense cooperation. It's called RDT&E, Research, Evaluation, Testing, and I missed one, research, development, testing, and evaluation. This should open the doors for further cooperation between our defense industries and militaries and security issues and so on. So this is really of paramount importance. We also will be signing the agreement, growth of in the Americas, América Crece, which basically provides financing for infrastructure projects in Brazil. This is very important for us. As was mentioned before, here we have perhaps the largest program of privatization in the infrastructure area, ports, railroads, roads around Brazil. We need that support, that input in finance. So this is going to be very important. We also we'll be holding the defense industry dialogue here in Washington right after the presidential visit. So what's missing from what I said so far? The economic and trade relationship, and that's something that we all agree we can go, can take further steps and deepen. There are some people who say that in order to achieve, a better trade relationship, we should first address all the irritants, all the pending hard issues that have been standing there for many years. We don't think that that's the most smart way to go about it. If you want to go, to a long course, you don't want to start by setting up obstacles for yourself. So, those issues will eventually be addressed. But we like very much the approach that was suggested in the study released today here by the Atlantic Council. We think that's the way to go. And I want to congratulate the others who are here and the others who are not. I think it's a great job in identifying areas where we can do things in a relatively short term. We can use those as building blocks towards more longer term objectives. These are mostly issues that don't require legislative involvement. They can be done by the executive sectors negotiating with very important support from the private sector. Some people in Brazil have suggested that it's very hard for us to have some sort of a deeper trade relationship because we compete so much in so many markets in so many specific areas. I would argue just the opposite. I think it's about time that we overcome this logic of competition for market access, trying to get a larger slice of each other's pie. And I see so much we can do to increase the size of the pie, and so that we all end up with a larger slice. That perhaps is the biggest example we have for that is the agribusiness sector. Brazil and the U.S. together, we feed more than half of the world. We have a tremendous potential. We have a very efficient agribusiness sector, and we can do much to open up markets, third markets for the exports of both of our countries. We are doing things together at the WTO, like in developing SPS standards together, promoting a science-based agriculture. This is an area that I see tremendous potential, and I think we should use what's been suggested here, this agenda that's been set up by this study, as a building blocks, as the paving of a road that might eventually lead us to a larger, more encompassing agreement. I want to wrap up just by recalling that there was a very important turning moment in Brazil-U.S. relationships a little over a century ago, when we had the patron of our diplomatic corps, Baron of Rio Branco. He was the first one, talking about 1905, 1912 was the period he was the foreign minister. He had this vision of the importance of the relationship with the United States at a time when we were only focused on Europe and especially Britain and other countries there. And he kind of started shifting our diplomatic agenda towards increased relationship with the United States. That period was then described by some historians as the unwritten alliance between the United States and Brazil. Perhaps it's time to start writing it, so that we have more something that will have more staying power. Somebody said here, will last longer and will be there for a while. So I conclude just by highlighting this, the importance of this study, of this approach in trying to keep the momentum going in our bilateral relationships in the trade area. And we all agree that we have tremendous opportunity before us. We cannot keep opportunity for later. This is a unique moment. We should grasp the moment and do the best for the future of Brazil and U.S. relations. Thank you very much.
Morning, everyone. My name is Roberta Braga. I'd like to just take a moment to welcome to the stage our panelists for panel number 1. Abrão Neto, Ken Hyatt, Ambassador Pedro Miguel. Come on up, please. Das O'Reilly, come, please. Thank you, Maria.
Among friends, huh?
Thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Roberta. I'm an associate director here at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, where I also lead our Brazil work. And if you were here with us, I think right about the same time last year, when we had the honor of welcoming Deputy Minister Marcos Troijo to kick off this partnership with APEX and our work on US-Brazil trade and FDI, you'll know that I am very happy to be here 1 year later, launching the effort that we've really put together with all of our partners here on stage, authors from US and Brazil, both policymakers and private sector leaders, APEX Brazil, the Embassy of Brazil, and really a lot of industry perspectives. It's really been a collaborative effort with a lot of stakeholders involved, many of you in this room. And so I just want to thank you all for your partnership and say how excited I am to be here for this conversation today. Throughout 2020, I think we've talked a lot about this. Our keynote speakers really highlighted the opportunities, but one of the core sort of centerpieces of this partnership was thinking through how the two countries can get to a potential free trade agreement and bilateral investment agreement, which they've both been discussing for years to come. But really, how can we this year in 2020, before municipal elections in Brazil, before elections here in the US, how can we pave the way for those longer term goals with practical stepping stones? Not only just concluding some of the work that's been in place dating back to 2014, as Ken will share with you some of the work that he had helped to start, but really concluding those smaller, more concrete examples of commitment and collaboration between the two countries, and then paving the way for an eventual trade agreement and investment agreement. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, some of which are here from Brazil today. So I'm very happy to welcome Ambassador Pedro Miguel da Costa Silva. He has been Brazil's Secretary for Bilateral and Regional Negotiations in the Americas since last year, 2019. He's a career diplomat with decades of experience in both trade and investment relations, as well as democracy issues and others. And he has served most recently as Minister Counselor both at the Embassies of Brazil in Madrid and the Embassy of Brazil in Ottawa. He returned to Brazil at the end of 2016, where he took office as head of the Department of Economics. So welcome, Ambassador Pedro Miguel.
Thank you.
Next to him is Maria Cameron, Deputy Director at the Office of Latin America and the Caribbean at the U.S. Department of State, working closely with these issues. Oh, I'm so sorry, U.S. Department of Commerce, working closely with Undersecretary Samsar, with Ken. She's really been at the forefront of these issues for both former administrations, current administrations, so she knows a lot about this theme and is here to share her perspectives with us. So thank you, Maria, for joining us. Prior to working on Brazil issues, she was also responsible for the Peru and Venezuela desk and covered e-commerce issues in the Office of NAFTA and Inter-American Affairs, so really an expert in the region more broadly as well as Brazil. Das O'Reilly, I'm sorry, but I'll skip you to go over to Das O'Reilly.
Come to join us.
Not yet.
Is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. He previously served as the Director of the Office of Brazil and Southern Cone Affairs at the U.S. Department of State as well, and he's a career member of the U.S. Foreign Service. So we're really happy that we're welcoming both current policymakers and former policymakers as well. Next to him, over in the middle, is, I am happy to say, one of our newest non-resident senior fellows for Brazil, Abrão Neto, who is also Executive Vice President of AmCham Brazil, where he represents more than 5,000 companies, which make up about 33% of Brazil's GDP. So really a variety of industries and sectors represented through Abrão's expertise. He also served as Secretary of Foreign Trade between 2016 and 2018, where he worked as a counterpart to Ken Hyatt. And finally then, I'd like to introduce Ken, who both Abrão and Ken, I'd like to say, are two of the authors for the paper that we're launching today. You'll hear from one of the other authors as well, and the fourth unfortunately couldn't be here today. But both Ken and Abrão have put together some of these ideas today. And Ken is senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group and a co-founder and partner at CM Partners, where he advises clients on exactly the issues that we'll be talking about: negotiations, trade, and investment matters. And as I said, he previously served at the U.S. Department of Commerce as the acting undersecretary and deputy undersecretary for international trade, where he worked with both Maria and as a counterpart to Abrão on these initiatives, some of which were started back in his day as well, and that continue and are set to be concluded soon. So thank you to all of our panelists once again. I would actually like to kick off the conversation by directing the first question to Maria. Brazil, as we all know, is the southern region's, South America's largest economy. It's one of the United States' largest trading partners. And so from a broad perspective, I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think the benefits, the concrete benefits are of a deeper commercial trade and investment relationship between the two countries. We'll start sort of with that larger overview, and then I'll go through and drill down a little bit further onto some of the specifics. But Maria, if you could provide your perspective.
Sure, thank you. We have so much to gain from a stronger commercial relationship with Brazil. Our bilateral trade is highly complementary, and it's in everyone's interest to increase our cooperation and strengthen ties. Our economies will grow stronger with increased cooperation, with more bilateral trade and investment. Our priorities in terms of trade and investment are to foster the conditions that lead to more of both. And at the Commerce Department, that means we are working through our bilateral mechanisms to prevent, reduce, and remove non-tariff barriers to trade. There's just so much good for all of our economies that I can't emphasize enough how important this is to everybody.
Thank you, Maria. I think you said it perfectly. And actually, I'd like to turn to Abrão for a follow-up, because Abrão, both you and Ken, Lisa and Danielle, you really drilled down on some of those core benefits with data, but also with sort of the geopolitical and strategic importance of the relationship. And so from the Brazilian perspective, I'd like to ask you what you think the concrete opportunities are that come with this deeper relationship as well.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's very good to be among good friends here. And I guess that to approach the potential benefits, I guess we could start saying that the United States is the largest economy in the world, so it is almost self-evident that enhancing the bilateral relationship will generate important opportunities for Brazil. This is true on the trade side. Just to give you a number, the United States import more than 10 times of the total value that Brazil exports globally, so that's the size of the prize, so as to say it. They are the main destination of our exports in services, of our exports in industrial goods, a very important source of our imports of inputs, capital goods, consumer goods. I mean, there's a lot to talk about on the trade side. There's a lot to talk about on the investment side as well. The United States is the first foreign direct investor in Brazil, with a stock of almost $120 billion. And by strengthening this relationship, this will boost FDI in both directions. And of course, we can take a look also in opportunities in other areas, as the ambassador mentioned, and Joe Samser here mentioned as well: infrastructure, energy, defense and security, the possibility of joining efforts to making the pie bigger. So that's everything very important. But if you allow me, I would also like to explore your question from another perspective, which is, what are the missed opportunities if Brazil and the United States do not strengthen their bilateral relationship? And for instance, if you take a look at the top 10 trading partners of Brazil, you will see that we either have or are negotiating trade agreements with 7 of them. So the exceptions are the United States, China, and Japan. And then you can make at least two conclusions out of that. The first one is that, well, those three countries will gradually, they are going to likely lose market share in Brazil due to the agreements that we are striking with these 7 other trading partners. And I'll give you a very concrete example. The United States and the European Union, they compete directly for a market of $60 billion per year in Brazil. So once the agreement that we recently concluded between Mercosur and the EU comes into effect, this will start to give the Europeans an edge over the United States. In the second, and of course this is valid too for Brazil with regards to all of the agreements that the United States are negotiating. And the second conclusion that I guess we might bring to this discussion is that the 2 largest trading partners we have, which are the United States and China, which we do not have trade agreements, they of course compete in our markets, but more than that, they are very important influencers of what's going on in the region. And I would dare to say that whoever moves faster and more efficiently might build an advantage that could prove crucial in the near future for shaping the economic landscape for the bilateral relationship, but for the broader areas, the broader regional area as well.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that this is sort of an inflection point, and with the strong relationship sort of at the highest levels of government between the 2 countries, it really would be a missed opportunity not to catalyze on that. I'm also glad that you brought up Mercosur, because I'd actually like to pivot to Ambassador Pedro Miguel with a question, and something that we've talked about as we were talking about a free trade agreement versus something we could do in 2020, and a reality that I think most of you are aware of, which is that Brazil is a member of Mercosur, and as such it's bound to negotiate agreements through the Mercosur directive. And so looking at the future of the relationship and the opportunities that we're talking about, what does it mean for Brazil to go forward in the short term as a member of Mercosur? And specifically, how is Brazil positioning itself within the trading bloc?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Well, I think the study, an excellent study that was prepared, shows that there are issues that we can negotiate bilaterally. And Brazil does negotiate bilaterally in the region, outside the region, a series of issues, some that are in this study, others that are not in this study. As Abraham already mentioned, last year I think Mercosur switched gears. I know you use automatic cars here in Brazil. I think everybody understands the analogy. Not only did we finish with the European Union and EFTA, most European countries, but we accelerated our negotiations with Canada, and that's. And I would stop here to say that the agreement that we're moving forward with Canada is a very ambitious, state-of-the-art agreement that includes all issues. I think that is one thing that will facilitate future agreements with countries that are neighbors of Canada. And we are moving also in an accelerated pace with Korea. We're moving forward with Singapore. We want to start, we're modernizing our agreement with Israel. We're in negotiations with Lebanon. We have proposed negotiations to Central American countries, and I can go on and on, just to show you that we're in a new position, and we were very much in line with our Mercosur colleagues. Uruguay and Paraguay from last year. Now there is a new government in Argentina, and we have received clear signals from them that they are engaged and ready and willing to move forward with us in the agenda that we have, which is a very ambitious one. So I think that the conditions are there for moving forward bilaterally or with Mercosur. It's just a matter of us getting agreement from the United States of what are the modalities and moving forward in several of the areas that are already there in which we have made progress, are making progress.
I think your point about sort of using other trade agreements that are being worked on as models or inspiration for the trade agreements that Brazil and the United States are considering is a point that we'll come back to later. Also because there's through USMCA negotiations, for example, there are some takeaways as well. But Abrão, I'd like to turn to you and Ken to talk a little bit about the short-term outcomes that we recommended in the report and some of the specific opportunities. We mentioned one of the main recommendations was in 2020, the United States and Brazil should consider working on a chapter-specific trade agreement. This isn't to say that they shouldn't focus on a free trade agreement in the longer term, but why miss the opportunity to start building something now? And so could you both expand a little bit, starting with Abrão, on what that chapter-specific agreement would entail and what doors it opens, and then I'll turn to Ken to talk a little bit about some of the recommendations around concluding ongoing work.
Okay. Well, probably from the suggestions we made for progress in the short run, one of the most important, if not the most important, is the idea of having this multi-chapter trade enhancement agreement between the two countries. And this would encompass a number of chapters. Some of them are already being discussed by the two governments, for instance, in the areas of trade facilitation and digital trade, but also in good regulatory practices and other areas that they may find that there is consensus to advance. And this would enable results in the short term. The idea is to wrap up the year, to wrap up 2020, saying, well, we were able to deliver at least the first step in the path to a more comprehensive and larger trade agreement. So it would work as a building block, as we already used that expression here, to a larger enterprise between the two countries. And then let me just strike two things here that were not our intention to argue. And this is important. Of course, we try to make clear everything that we said, but it's also important to make clear what we didn't want to say in there. The first one you already mentioned. We are not suggesting that both governments should not engage in a negotiation of a more comprehensive trade agreement. Of course, if both governments say that they are ready to do so, we'll be the first ones there supporting that and undersigning this enterprise. What we are saying is that given the complexities, political, technical, and the time demanding for engaging in a comprehensive trade agreement, one might want to initiate trying to harvesting what it's already at hand, and this would enable this would energize the relationship for more ambitious initiatives. Then the second thing has to do with Mercosur, because we are suggesting that this bilateral approach of negotiating a multi-chapter agreement of non-tariffs can already be done under the Mercosur rules. And by that we're not saying that Brazil should leave Mercosur or that Brazil should seek to change Mercosur rules to being allowed to negotiate FTAs and tariffs by itself. No, what we're saying is, as Ambassador Pedro Miguel mentioned, Brazil is already exploring this avenue of negotiating bilateral agreements in non-tariff areas, such as services, public procurement, investment, and other rules. So why not explore this avenue, which could allow us to start delivering or to continue to deliver important results for the bilateral relationship.
Thank you, Abrão. Das O'Reilly, before I go over to you, I'd like to pass the floor to Ken, just to expand a little bit on what we can do, sort of the low-hanging fruit of what we can do in 2020 that was already started and has been progressing over the years, things that you started off working on, that Maria has worked on extensively. Give us your perspective on what it is that we can accomplish in the next months.
And having been in government for many years, I'm never quite certain what low-hanging fruit means.
We love our jargon.
That being said, we thought of the recommendations in two categories. One, what are some efforts that have been underway that we should try to bring home, that we should try to bring to fruition. And we put two that I'd highlight in that category. One is concluding the mutual recognition agreement of the trusted traders. I believe we started working on that before Abrao was my colleague in 2015. The two presidents last year spoke about this as a priority. So that is sort of one area that we thought should be brought home. And it has very, very, very tangible economic value, goods moving more quickly through customs. It also has national security benefits in that the customs agents can spend more time focused on the other cargoes that are not trusted as they come through. So that's one. And the second is the adoption of electronic phytosanitary certificates. Again, something that I remember we began working on when the Ministry of Agriculture in Brazil came to observe us, probably also 2015, 2016. So those were two that we felt there should be priority to bring home. And they do take priority because they're interagency issues, so that's sort of category one. The second category of short-term efforts to supplement, again, the chapter work that Abrao described, and some of these are new. For the most part, they are continuing and perhaps adding, shifting emphasis a little bit to ongoing efforts. There's been a lot of work in the regulatory area on good regulatory practice. What we suggest in the report is that to continue with a shift, a possible shift of emphasis. Much of the work in the good regulatory practice area has been oriented toward public consultation and regulatory impact analysis, these cores of good regulatory practice. And we're asking or suggesting that the governments consider adding emphasis on the whole of government approach. In the USMCA, it's a central regulatory body. So that was one area that we suggested as a shift, or as a shift in emphasis. Secondly, in the regulatory area, Abrao and I, Daniel and I, Maria and I worked for years on how do we get sectors to cooperate to drive forward possible regulatory enhancements, whether it's in the conformity assessment area, what's in the regulatory area. And so we're arguing, we've suggested some possible sectors, oil and gas, healthcare, life sciences, some of the emerging sectors, IoT, AI, gene editing. And the request to the private sectors is that two private sectors come together and separately, first together and then separately go to the governments, but come saying we, the two sectors, the Brazilian and American private sector, would like to drive regulatory cooperation in these areas. And again, our experience was we often ran into one, the Americans wanted us to do something and there were blocks on the Brazilian side or vice versa, and we're really arguing let's go sectoral and let's get cooperation. We've also highlighted the standards development area and the standards development process, and in that particular area we are suggesting more emphasis, more communication, more cooperation on emerging standards, as opposed to try to have conversations around that which has already been agreed to, is to focus again in the future. And we've suggested AI, IoT, and gene editing as three areas to focus the standards development process. And for us, that both has a benefit of better standards, right? But it also has important consequences in terms of the adoption of those technologies, and I would actually go so far as to say competitiveness. Two final recommendations that we...
Ken, if I can just interrupt, that's where we're trying to prevent the trade barrier before it's in place. I just...
Yeah. Thank you, Maria. The other two I'd highlight, and the ambassador talked about this a little bit, in the trade and investment area, it has never been my experience we cooperate well enough in third countries. And so we've sort of put very explicitly a recommendation to identify areas of possible trade and investment policy cooperation where the US and Brazil to a third country talk about. The agriculture area is, of course, one of those areas.
That is exactly my question to Kevin O'Reilly, Das O'Reilly, about the benefits of the third-party cooperation. And so
you two must know one another.
So I'd just like to stop you there and actually turn to you, Das O'Reilly, about that specific area. And so the authors, Ken, Abrão, Lisa, who's also here, they argued that the United States and Brazil have a lot of potential to influence third countries in areas of trade and investment, but also in other policy issues, agriculture, investment facilitation, technology. And so I wanted to pass the floor to you to talk a little bit about how that joint collaboration might position the United States and Brazil to influence critical trade and investment issues worldwide, sort of beyond the hemisphere as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I mean, Abrão touched on this just a few moments ago. You know, out of our top, say, trading partners, the United States' top trading partners, Brazil's top trading partners, more than half of them are markets that we both compete in and very successfully. That, you know, half of our top 15 or so, roughly, are also the same. And in our hemisphere, whether they're in our top 10 or 15 trading partners or not, or among those, we're the top 1, 2, 3, or 4 trading partner with the overwhelming majority of the countries in our hemisphere. So if we can think pragmatically about sort of common principles about how we want to advance our trade agenda in those places where we are significant players, and in those sectors where we are important actors, and in the region as a whole, we have a little bit of influence. We are 2 of the largest economies on the planet. And, you know, you were touching on a number of issues which I think are, you know, something we always have to think about. Any trade deal isn't the press release. It's not the bumper sticker that we put on the back of the car, whether it's with an automatic or maybe even electric. It's
talk about emerging technology.
That's right. There we go. It's, you know, it digs deep into how we function, not only as states, as governments, but as our economies. And so it takes a lot of nuts and bolts work. But if you come with clearly defined priorities and clearly defined principles, and we can come to a meeting of a mind, there's an awful lot that we can do together and have a really significant influence. I suspect that there are a couple of refugee survivors in this room of the ALCA process, and, you know, some had said that this was at one point presented in some places in the hemisphere as some sort of economic annexation. Well, no one annexes the 9th largest economy on the planet. That's crazy. No one annexes an agricultural superpower like Brazil, but we can work in partnership, and when we do it, and we do it effectively, we not only make those pies a little bit larger, but we also can set norms. And one of the important things is we work towards other types of trade agreements that we're constantly aware of that sort of emerging technologies, that emerging areas principle that you spoke about, that we don't go off in uncoordinated directions and find that we've put ourselves in a box. You know, we've been very transparent. This is more a USTR lead than something the State Department does every day, but we've been very transparent about the principles that we have advocated and pursued with the USMCA agreement, and they're there and open for people to take a clear and close and detailed look at, sector by sector or chapter by chapter, and it creates for us, I think, a pretty clear roadmap as to the principles upon which we're going to base future negotiations.
I'd actually like to take a moment to dig a little bit deeper into that, particularly industry opportunities and how agreements like USMCA and the EU-Mercosur agreement can be helpful to kickstart these conversations between the United States and Brazil in regard to particular industries. And so what precedents have USMCA set that could guide discussions that Brazil and the United States have? And I'd like to not only pose that question to you, but also to Maria and Ambassador Pedro Miguel as well, to offer your perspectives.
I'm looking for that extra chair where the folks from the U.S. Trade Representative's office are. And since they're not actually sitting here, I think I will actually tread reasonably lightly. But I think it's, I mean, look, I'm being a bit flip, but the fact that we've been very transparent about where we would like to see sort of what kinds of principles we want to see developed in trade negotiations, I think makes it, although it's difficult and complex, it makes it fairly clear in the areas that you were talking about, in digital economies, in regulatory, establishing sort of clear regulatory frameworks, and better ideal regulatory practice and facilitation. These are excellent places to start that conversation.
And if I can just, I'm all about the weeds and the details. And so, and so looking at the USMCA and looking at the specifics and the chapters and identifying the sticking points, the problems, where are the biggest divergences, and using that as a starting point for an agenda item, a topic, something that we can start to really dig deeply in, whether it's in the commercial dialogue or the defense dialogue or wherever it is, so that when it rises to the point where USTR is ready to discuss it, we've already solved a lot of the problems. We understand each other better. We've got a better understanding so that when we're ready to have the more formal discussions, we can be productive. And so that's where we are right now.
And Ambassador Pedro Miguel, before you answer, I'm going to add another question to your question, which is being cognizant of time and knowing that I do want to take some Q&A from the audience, posing to you also the question of accession to the OECD and how Brazil's process of acceding to the OECD will pave the way for better relationship with the United States, trade and investment-wise. But I'll let you answer that first.
A lot of interesting issues here. But maybe the best way is to try to answer it in two parts. The first part is, I told a very high-ranking American official once that Brazil would have no problem looking at the USMCA model of agreement. So I think that is a very clear sign. I use the car analogy now, I'm going to use the dance analogy. Brazil will dance to different rhythms depending on the moment. So we're ready. As I said, negotiated with Canada and a certain type of because if you look at the world, I don't want to say that it is separated in different types of models of regulation, but there is a bit of that going on. So we have just concluded negotiations with the Europeans. It's one model. We're moving forward with Korea and Canada, another type of model. Abrão mentioned here, or somebody mentioned Japan. We have been approaching Japan. They take their time, but we also want to initiate negotiations with them and with South Asian countries such as Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. Everything is on the table. So this to say about the model of agreement. We can move fast, we can move slow. We're ready to do everything at the same time. Even though we're going to kill our negotiators, we're going to spend the rest of their time on planes. So that would be the trade part of the answer. I would like to make one short comment about agriculture. I agree completely with what was said, but we shouldn't make agriculture the big boogeyman. The fact that the United States and Brazil compete for the same markets and in some of the same products, it's not an issue because all of the deals that Brazil and Mercosur are negotiating at this time are with countries that have sensitive agricultural sectors. Right. That's part of life, and we are working with that. We have to be realistic and pragmatic, even though it's one of our main interests. We are also interested in these agreements as transformational instruments to open our economy, integrate our economy in global value chains, modernize Brazil. That's what it is about. Finally, OECD, and I can keep it short. Our request to initiate accession to the OECD, the domestic reforms that we are implementing, and these trade agreements, they are all moving Brazil in the same direction. So if and when we finally, now we have the US support and the US can convince the other big players that we need to initiate this negotiation at the OECD, there will be another negotiation, because you have the trade committee and a series of other committees which Brazil will have to pass through, and we will have to see whether we meet the bar or not. So all of this is part of a process in which we count on the United States to be a partner sometimes and to help us to achieve something that our private sector from both countries have been asking to us for a long time. Sorry if I took a bit longer.
No, you didn't.
But I was short in my first reply.
Go ahead.
Just very quickly, we can see, and we definitely know that we have some very good dancers on both sides, and they are very dynamic and can dance to different rhythms. But if we look, for taking the USMCA as an example, if we take a look at some specific chapters, we will find out that we are dancing the same tune. For instance, digital trade. If you look, the chapter of the USMCA for digital trade and the chapter of the Brazil-Chile FTA agreement on electronic commerce, the structure of the chapters are the same. No wonder, because we were inspired by some previous negotiations that the United States were participating, but there are not a lot of differences in there. So just want to bring that up, because I guess sometimes we can start dancing right away in some areas. In others, of course, we'll have to practice a little bit more.
Fair enough. As a Brazilian who's been in the US for 20 years, I'm a terrible dancer, so I don't know what that says about my Brazilian-ness. We are just about out of time, and I do want to open the floor for questions. Before we do, I'll ask Ken and Abrão to just very quickly, if you could leave our audience with just one tidbit of food for thought about how we can all support a deepening of the relationship between the two countries economically. Companies are represented in this room. We have consulting firms represented in this room, embassies. And so in one or two sentences, what would you say?
Well, I'll give you 3 sentences. First, continue to create value, generate results, because results communicate to people that it's worth the relationship. Second, continue to connect our private sectors. I have been struck that I don't believe our private sectors often have as much access to each other as is necessary. And the great work that Costa does, for instance, to connect, but I think we need more connection at the private sectors. Third, a big relationship is the sum of many small relationships. And I think each of us actually can contribute to the broader relationship by caring about the relationship, being reliable in what we say, communicating that the other matters, and the very fact that we're sitting together, right? We made commitments at a working, diplomatic, and personal level, which are with us today, which create value. So each of us can add to the sum by working the individual.
Well, I would just add, in doing that, try to do that in an organized way. We have some very important organizations that can help in trying to find what are the mutual and the shared view on what the priorities are. So this is probably one thing. And the other is try to involve as many stakeholders as possible. And this is nothing that everyone here already know, but well, we've seen people from Congress here this morning. Of course, they are extremely important in this dialogue. The executive branches, the private sector, everyone, the think tanks, everyone together may help things running smoother.
That's great, and I'll just add to that that our work doesn't end here. As a third-party organization, civil society, NGO, nonpartisan in nature, hopefully we can continue to be an asset for building the momentum that has already been in place and keeps growing stronger every year. So I would like to thank our panelists and open the floor to questions. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Alex Sanchez, James Defense. Question: when it comes to partnerships, I was wondering if you can talk more about the Embraer-Boeing partnership. $4.2 billion. Boeing's going to now control, essentially it's the crown jewel of Brazilian's aerospace industries. What do you think about this partnership, and how does it fit U.S. economic relations going nowadays and going forward? Thank you.
I'll take that. Defense and security represented, they might be able to add to that as well. So we'll take one more question before we answer. So first on defense and security.
Hi, attorney at Elsa.
Microphone.
Oh, thank you. I have a question about the potential challenges that the coming elections, if that could potentially make it hard to prioritize the negotiation of an FTA on the short term. Thank you.
So I will start with the defense and security question, understanding that maybe we might not be able to go as deeply as we'd want to, but maybe at Brown and at AmCham you do represent some companies in that sector. Ken, Maria, you work actively with those industries. So.
The Embraer-Boeing partnership is just a really good example of how strong our economies and how complementary they are. Even before they formalized that partnership, we always use the cooperation between the two companies as an example of what we wanted to see more of in the U.S.-Brazil relationship. So we're really pleased to see that and happy to support it.
Well, I would just add that maybe not talking specifically about the two companies, but this is an area in which we could see that private sector work contributed a lot for understanding what are each other's priorities and for trying to advance at the same in the same direction. So I guess we can rely on that example for the other areas that business sectors may want to try to find common ground.
I think this might be a good moment for me to mention that we are working on a policy brief on this specific topic, so U.S.-Brazil collaboration in defense and security, and this case study will definitely factor into that. So you can expect that to come out in the next 2 months.
And if I can just add, I was remiss in pointing out we have the U.S.-Brazil Defense Industry Dialogue Working Group meetings next week. That came out of the U.S.-Brazil CEO Forum. It is really government, private sector, at all levels, which makes it a beast to manage, but really productive and focused discussions. And next week we'll have the working groups meeting that will lead into a meeting hopefully later in the fall.
If I could jump in for a second here, I'm sorry, Pedro,
No,
Miguel,
go ahead.
but
Go ahead.
you know, Embraer is a significant investor in the United States, creates jobs in this country, it has many of its suppliers are either U.S. firms or have links here. This partnership is best, and you know, I'm the diplomat amateur here on this. It's created opportunities for significant new investment in Brazil and bringing in a first-class firm with deep engineering expertise into Brazil and helping an already top-drawer firm increase its capacity to compete in the market. That's jobs for Brazilians, that's investment into Brazil, that's opportunity. I'm not sure if I've never really accepted the one element, I think, with respect to the underlying thesis that this is some sort of a setback for either the United States or for Brazil industry or for the depth and reach and capacity of Brazilian industry to serve the global markets.
If I can compliment right in there, and it's not a setback, it's a necessity, because this is a very specific industry in which you have very few players, and it's a complicated market in which you have some rules and other rules are not followed, so the fact that they are together makes them able to compete better.
And to the second question, if it's possible to, in 2 minutes, talk about Mercosur.
1 minute, 30 seconds.
I'll leave that to you.
Very simple. You are correct in saying that we have decision 3200. But first thing is what I already said. At this stage, we are all together in the same agenda. Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. What Brazil has made very clear to all our Mercosur partners is we are sticking with this agenda. We are in a hurry. We want to catch up. So as long as everybody's moving in the same direction, we move together. But if somebody needs time, if somebody is not convinced, we're going to have to find solutions. And that's what we diplomats are for finding solutions. So it's not going to be a legal text or something that's written there that is going to impede Brazil from continuing this agenda. We're not going to stop, and we're not going to change course. So that's a very clear message that I want diplomatically to put here to all of you who are thinking that maybe there will be some impediments on the road. There won't be, and we're not going back to the past. That's over.
Talk about momentum.
Okay.
I think that's a great note to end on.
Less than a minute.
That was, I'm pretty sure. I'd like to thank all of our panelists again. The next panel is the private sector perspective with various industries represented. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us today. All right. I am going to take no time at all, and I am actually going to just jump in and ask everyone to stay seated, please. Everyone, please take your seats. I will just jump right in for the sake of time. I know we have about 30 more minutes. But a conversation on US-Brazil trade and investment really wouldn't be complete without the perspective of the private sector. And I know that all of your perspectives can complement what was talked about now. But we were also lucky to count with all of your insight throughout this process. And so private sector support, these decisions don't get made only in government. You're the ones working it the day-to-day. You're the ones really implementing. You're the ones investing. Your companies win and lose from these realities. And so I'm excited for the second panel conversation today. And I will go right in and introduce our three panelists, starting with Stephen Bipes on my left. Stephen works for AdvaMed. He has over 15 years of experience in policy development and advocacy, including regulatory streamlining, international operations, all of those things directly linked to what we'll talk about today. He also, more importantly, specializes on Brazil and Latin America and focuses on regulatory best practices. It's a conversation that we've been having now, I think, for many months. Prior to joining AdvaMed, he served as the executive director for the American Chamber of Commerce in Rio de Janeiro. So again, representing various industries. So welcome, Stephen. Next to him is Elisa Schindler, one of our stellar authors, a macroeconomist who really was able to lend her perspective to talking about the real economic benefits of trade and investment between the two countries. She is a director for Latin America Sovereign Ratings at S&P Global Ratings and is a lead analyst in sovereign international public finance for the Americas, but not only for Brazil, but also Argentina and Mexico. And next to her is Lisa Schroeder, a longtime friend of the center as well. She's Global Director of Trade and Investment Policy at Dow, where she oversees global function and cross-business priorities. And so we'll be representing the chemical industry perspective. She has in her career focused on trade, policy, trade negotiations, investment issues that directly foster growth for Dow. And so there's really no better person to provide the perspective on the exact topics that we'll talk about today. And so thank you again, all three of you, for joining us. I will start right away, but I'll start with a question that I'm actually going to pose to all of you to make things easier. And it connects to what we talked about in panel one. So sort of taking what we discussed in panel one, you're all here representing your respective sectors, opportunities, the benefits for the trade agreement, landscape, be it a specific chapter agreement or an eventual free trade agreement. And so I wondered if you could very quickly, from your industry perspective, tell us a little bit about what those core benefits are really like and what these opportunities are, both in the short term, 2020, but more long term. Starting with you, Stephen.
Well, thank you, Roberta. Thank you, Jason, and the Atlantic Council for the opportunity to participate in the conversation, and also for the excellent study. We, as the medical device manufacturers and as parts of broader industry, parts of the Brazil-U.S. Business Council, have been supportive of this type of a multi-chapter approach. And we very much endorse and agree with the idea that we're not limiting in any way what the two governments can do. If they can conclude a comprehensive trade agreement in 6 months, wonderful. If not, get done what you can get done. And I will repeat this in my ending remarks. Maybe aim for the end of April, and then with any luck, you'll have something by the end of June to announce, because after that, we're getting into the election season, and even without requiring a Mercosur or a congressional vote, it gets difficult to do everything. But maybe just talking briefly about the U.S. industry the last couple of years has been working on the USMCA. Putting aside some of the more polemic chapters, say automotive rules of origin, we do think that most of the chapters are state-of-the-art, best-in-class chapters for meaningful 21st century trade agreements. If you look at, say, the 34 chapters that are there, roughly a third pertain to the rules of doing business. And if we, as two countries, can lock in commitments in the first half of this year on roughly that third or a good subsection of them, I think that we would that'd be a very good down payment on greater ambitions we have. And I'll talk a little bit later about what specifically we'd like.
Perfect. Lisa and Lisa, I'll turn to you. You can go ahead. This won't be easy, I can tell.
I think I'm going to kind of step back, so because you highlighted also kind of think longer term. I think there's been a lot of discussion about the specifics and leveraging what is, I think, a key relationship. And that's part of a broader long-term U.S. relationship with Brazil that is, I think, anchored, when I step back as a macroeconomist, in part through just the overall orientations of the economy and the democracy component of both countries. And I think that's the key piece. When I was re-looking at our report and thinking about the importance of the OECD, which we'll be circling back to, one of the things that struck me is how Brazil is a key, I forget if the exact lingo, if it's a chair, a key role in the PISA committee at the OECD. And I thought to myself, we haven't even talked about education. And in terms of we're thinking long-term growth and improved productivity in Brazil, education is key. And we noted in the beginning, the very front end of our report, that the increase of of Brazilian students coming to the U.S. So I think one of the next steps I would think, I'm just totally stepping back, that as I've reflected on this, is how you can tap in deeper educational ties and improvements in education in both countries. I mean, the U.S. is higher than Brazil on the PISA scores, but it is also not at the top. We have educational challenges here as well. But Brazil is much lower down, and it's lower down, it's below the OECD average. That was one of the things that I came to as I was sitting back here, just again, thinking very long term, but enhanced, to link it back, enhanced trade flows, enhanced investment flows that feed into a strengthened, you would want those to feed into a strengthened Brazilian economy, but to tap that and to meaningfully be more integrated besides all the other logistical pieces in the global value chain, you have to have education improve in Brazil as well.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's not directly something that we discuss in depth in the report, but we recently launched the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center Advisory Council, and a lot of our members, which include former presidents and governors from all over the region, they did bring up education. And we talk about emerging technologies and what more important aspect of that than education. Lisa, I'd like to turn to you from the chemical industry perspective. I know that you even sent me some of Dow's perspectives for the paper earlier this year. I wondered if you could quickly share what this means for the chemical industry and what the opportunities are that you see in the shorter term.
Absolutely, and with thanks and congratulations to Atlantic Council and the amazing authors for this report. We really appreciated that there was such an effort to bring in so many different industry perspectives so that we could make it as tangible as possible. So thank you. And I want to go back actually to some of the points that have come through or been threaded through this entire day's conversations, and especially as the ambassador was pointing out, when we have almost 200 years of history in the relationship, why is it, as Joe said, so much momentum now? And particularly as an American company, but as what we consider to be a Brazilian company too, with Dow's long-time investments in the country, why are we able to gain so much momentum now? And I think that relates to really two things. There is political will in the relationship like we've really never experienced before, both bilaterally and with the support for Brazil's tremendous efforts to accede to the OECD. And that is matched, what is really unique about this moment in time is how much that is matched by the commercial alignment. I mean, we have this terrific report, we have the AmCham, ABRAU's priority issues, the Brazil-US Business Council, and the US-Brazil CEO Forum, where we as Dow sit as the chair of the Trade, Tax, and Regulatory Committee. When you look across that, an incredible amount of just common cause. And that is such a terrific opportunity for us to build on great momentum, to move forward on short-term, medium-term, long-term objectives, building the relationship, but also creating a much better cooperative dynamic so that we can share and help each other grow right now. And when we think about it from the chemical industry, this is a perfect example. Under the Trump administration, we've seen tremendous progress for not just chemicals, but broader manufacturing based on that domestic reform agenda. As this administration pursued tax reform, regulatory simplification, energy policy that supports competitive shale gas for manufacturing, these are all key areas that have created an extraordinary enabling environment for American manufacturing, and very much align exactly with President Bolsonaro's agenda. Tax reform, regulatory simplification, energy. That is how we can move forward on a lot of sharing the best practices, the lessons we've learned, so that we each have that kind of strong, competitive, enabling environment so that our domestic industries are that much more competitive as we pursue these trade market access openings. Trusted Trader is a perfect example. As Ken said, that's clearly something we should be able to get done this year. And as the ambassador was saying, with a dedicated infrastructure program, what better way to align these opportunities, Trusted Trader, custom simplification, and infrastructure modernization that allows us to clear more product through port. For the chemical industry, that means clearing inputs that allow all the downstream manufacturing to make everything from the polyurethane foam in the chairs you're sitting on to polyester in the clothes that you're wearing. Or other great products that all create more opportunities for employment, consumer satisfaction, and growth.
No, that's perfect. And I'm glad that you brought up the tax reform, both from the US side and the Brazilian side, because Lisa, in the report you did talk a lot about the opportunities for reform and how that could simplify the cost of doing business in Brazil and open new doors for investors in the US. And so I wondered if I could actually combine two questions for you. So one is, could you go a little bit deeper into, for the United States, what does Brazil's tax reform, potential tax reform, mean, and what are the benefits of that? But also, your diagnosis on how healthy Brazil's economy is right now, and with the projected reform sort of on the horizon, where do you see that going?
Yeah.
on the tax piece, I think one big picture as a macroeconomist, I've heard it for 20 years since I started looking at Brazil. We need to do an ICMS reform. Okay, what is ICMS? It's the state value-added taxes that are at different rates among the 27 entities in Brazil, and there are 5,000 municipalities, so you have other local taxes there, et cetera. So the complexity of Brazil's tax system, the complexity, the burden is high, and particularly the burden when you take into account the high degree of informality, which had improved, but then given the difficulties of the economy in recent years, informality has risen yet again. So then you have an extra burden on formal companies, et cetera. So it's the high level of the tax burden, and it's the complexity and overlapping taxes. I've constantly heard of this, and the competition between the states as they're trying to attract investments with trying to lower rates. We may be at a momentous moment in the sense that it is on the government's agenda. It comes on and off, and one of the risks in Brazil from its fiscal position, which we can get to then the health of the economy, there's really not space to lower Brazil's still high tax burden from the fiscal perspective, because it's very difficult to cut the spending, including pension spending. Yes, there was a reform, but that was more to keep spending from growing more than actually cutting pensions. So, but within that, there's a lot of room to clean up and simplify the overlapping taxes. It's over 1,500 hours per the World Bank in terms of the time per year to deal with paying taxes. In other key markets, second largest economy in LATAM, Mexico, it's under 200, or it's around 200, or 400, and China is even lower. So we're talking about key competitors here. So the cumbersomeness, the time spent. So at the moment, there is political momentum from a broad tax reform in Brazil. Then you can think about how you can bring in the dialogue on specific points that are more conducive from the U.S. perspective. But the fact that the Brazilian administration is interested, in theory, the finance minister on the campaign was telling, we want to lower taxes, we want to lower the corporate tax rate, et cetera. Again, how you do this with fiscal prudence is a tricky balancing act. But besides those statements, you have Congress with key senators, the head of the lower house, who are supporting this momentum. So you have buy-in from legislators. So from that sense, and buy-in from the governors, because also the proposals on the table would have it deal with a slow transition, which you need to make politically feasible, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But simplifying multiple taxes, and I could put the acronyms out, then your head will swirl, but combining federal taxes, potentially, if it's even more aggressive, with the local the state value-added tax into one national value-added tax, and harmonizing, that would simplify. And it would presumably open up resources for more productive use, seemingly higher growth over time.
I think it's definitely a challenge for Brazil, and one we're following very closely, and sort of piggybacking off of what Brazil has done to simplify and reform its systems and to open up to the world and open up to the United States. I did want to talk to the privatization. So Brazilian government, and this question is for Stephen, Brazilian government has privatized a number of the country's public enterprises, and they've done so in an effort to diminish the size of the state and the economy, et cetera. But how specifically are privatizations helping foster investment into Brazil? And how can public-private partnerships improve the investment environment as well?
Okay, I'm going to try and, one of my professional goals is to make the term GRP as important, if not more important, than IP. I know IP kind of gets a disproportionate amount of attention in DC and in trade negotiations, and the conversation bends to that. I think it needs to be the heart of a trade agreement, and it pertains to your question. So if you'll give me some rope here for just a minute, a didactic moment. Often, when I used to talk to the reinsurance industry, I mean, those poor guys, it's so boring. I mean, when the reinsurance people talk, the insurance people fall asleep. And
I think the director of our Resilience Center would disagree with you.
Well, and they need like a Samba Queen as a spokesperson or something, because it's tough. So when you say regulatory, immediately your boss, the CEO, the minister, the president, they fall asleep, and they think it's some arcane standards thing, dBs, volts, and microseconds. It's not it. So maybe just a didactic moment. There's GRP, whole of government, good regulatory practices, which are how a government makes its rules, how it does its rulemaking, the rules for the rules. That's one thing. And that's really the heart, that's the chapter in the USMCA, that's really what we need with Brazil. The other thing is regulatory convergence. So FAA, ANAC, FCC, Anatel, Anvisa, FDA, sector-specific regulatory convergence, standards, harmonization, alignment. That's great, it's necessary, but the convergence is limited unless you have the GRP piece, unless you have the central regulatory oversight body, an analog to the Administrative Procedure Act, where you've got, the 10 OECD elements of regulatory agenda, regulatory impact assessment, and Brazil does a really good job with notification to the WTO and public consultation, but things like in the rulemaking process, cost-benefit analysis, using international standards as the basis for the regulation, not as an afterthought. So building that into a trade agreement, which is aligned with the OECD rules, the way we have in the USMCA, I think is a great starting point. And I often joke, kind of tongue-in-cheek, saying if you had a one-chapter trade agreement, if you had only a GRP chapter, it would organically create the other 33 chapters, because it requires the government in its decisions and actions to do things in a reasonable and transparent way. So I'm going to make that pitch because often the conversation comes back to IP. And just before I answer your question, again, give me just a minute. Many of you in this room have heard me roll out and frame this conversation with the four numbers of 5, 10, 20, 30. So average global tariffs are 5%, Brazil's higher, 8 or 12, but for all product categories, not just medical devices. But the tariff equivalent of customs and efficiencies is 10%. In Brazil, it's higher, I think 14% for imports and 13% for exports, according to the Brazilian National Confederation of Industry. The tariff equivalent of non-tariff technical barriers to trade caused by the lack of a GRP policy is 20%, so a 20% tariff equivalent. And the lack of ethical business conduct is equivalent to a 10 to 30% import tariff. So if you have a trade agreement that has 4 chapters of customs and trade facilitation, good regulatory practices, throw in technical barriers to trade if you can do it, anti-corruption, maybe digital trade, you get the tools to eliminate the equivalent of a 60% import tariff before you begin the important work of eliminating the tariffs. And so if we think of the 34 USMCA chapters, of the 11, we want to lock those in. Brazil has to do it to get into the OECD. Let's put it into a trade agreement, what's the term we're using? Not trade modernization.
Chapter-specific.
Enhanced. Let's do that now. Let's lock it in. All roads lead to Rome. Now to your question. So when we get to the question of, if you ask what the markets want, well, markets generally say they want, privatization, right? But I would say there's a bigger question, because there's no magic number per economy of what percentage of the businesses are public or private. It varies by culture and society. But taking a step back, how much state is the right amount? And if we bend it back to regulatory, how much regulation is the right amount? A regulator asked this. What's the appropriate amount of regulation? And the answer to that isn't from a trade agreement, from a number that gets negotiated. It comes from having a GRP chapter. And if you have a GRP chapter and implemented in the domestic rulemaking process, all of the decision making will go through the checklist to come up with the proper number. And so I just want to note 3 things, and then I'll shut up. The supply chain for products and increasingly services is global and market-based. Markets require regulation. And so you need to have GRP to determine that right amount. The second part, I know traditionally the messiness of the US market is not as attractive for some in Brazil as the Scandinavian or Northern European models, but what's often overlooked is that those systems are most notable for being market-based and well-regulated. It's really impressive. You look at healthcare in the Netherlands, it's a well-regulated market of private health insurers. And then 3, and then I'll stop. No, I'm part of a dying breed here in Washington, and that I'm a pro-trade, pro-business Democrat, right? We're diminishing. We're going into extinction. And what I struggle with in conversations with those to my political left, not my left here, but my political left, are this idea that just because you own something, you fix it. What's wrong with Uber? I mean, you don't have to own the thing for it to work better. And just because you own, and often when you own something, it reduces the pressure to regulate it well. Monopolies require regulation. Government monopolies require regulation by professionals following an international set of criteria for regulation. All of a long way to say, privatization good, more important is GRP.
Fair enough. I don't think I have anything to add to that, so I'm just going to pivot to something completely different for the sake of time again, because I think we're already 10 minutes out from the end of today. But I wanted to pose this question to both of you, Lisa and Lisa. And it's about digital connectivity, and so sort of talking about new opportunities to leverage infrastructure investment to drive better digital connectivity. What would that mean to industry, and what rules are necessary to bring digital benefits to the Brazilian economy? What is already being done, and what more could be done?
All right, I'll take that one up. But first, I do want to echo Steve's call to action on regulatory. We do think it's a terribly fascinating area of trade to deal with. I know, maybe not necessarily requiring a samba queen to represent it, although maybe. Either way, but I think it goes back to Ken's call to action. I mean, within the chemical industry, there's incredible alignment. And I think, as we've talked about some of the previous panel, USMCA, the biggest win in that agreement for us was a regulatory cooperation chapter specific to chemicals. First time we've achieved that in a trade agreement, and it is groundbreaking. Because what it really lays out is the principles by which a regulatory system should be built. Sound science, risk assessment, and the broader GRP issues, notice, consultation, how you really engage industry with the technical expertise that we have to help regulators reach a high standard, but one that's aligned with the overall government agenda of economic competitiveness. So we see that as a real potential sector area we could move this year. There is a draft chemical regulatory management law that's pending in the Brazilian Congress. We have a lot of expertise. We've even hosted an industry workshop in Sao Paulo last year to kind of get not only Brazilian regulators engaged. One of the big deliverables of that meeting was an MOU between Brazil and Argentina to cooperate on developing chemical management scheme. And then looking at how that would help create a standard that would help the other countries of Latin America, often smaller, maybe more resource constrained ministries as well, be able to do the job. Ensure strong health and human safety provisions while being economically competitive. So we see Reg Co-op as one of those areas where that's a chapter we would be happy to start writing right now and achieve some real progress on. But I think the digital is such a perfect example, again, of where that industry, public sector collaboration can really drive meaningful gains. There's so much work being done on policy now, as it should be. Data privacy, cross-border data flows. But one of the things that we need to do a better job of is injecting that voice of manufacturing. When you look at the amount of digital technology investments that manufacturing, especially the chemical industry, are doing, we have a lab with a digital platform in Brazil that we were inaugurating as a way of giving customers more opportunities to test innovation. These are all terrific examples of what technology can do, providing that we have the right policy agenda. We're allowed cross-border data flows. There aren't issues of forced data localization, so that we really can benefit from these amazing investments, the technology opportunities that exist.
I think we might have a call to action. I know Steve and I already talked about this, but maybe we'll have to take up good regulatory practices as the next follow-up body of work. But we are just about out of time again, and I'd like to open up for questions as I did before. So I'll ask one last question to all three of you. And that is, from the private sector perspective, speaking with governments, which you do often, what is one point you would make regarding the bilateral relationship? And and or one point that you would really highlight for the room as being particularly important to address yet this year and then beyond 2021?
We've got 3. Launched the double taxation treaty negotiations. We understand their challenges. There's a lot domestically going on, but there's such an opportunity for growth there. Getting the trusted trader AEO deal done, and picking out especially these key areas where sectors can work together to promote a common cooperative regulatory agenda. There is so much momentum.
Great. All recommendations that our authors thought were important as well.
Interesting, isn't that?
Isn't it? Lisa, and you?
I'll go back to one of the things. I think it's continued work on the OECD front. That's something as a macroeconomist I see as key, and given the particular momentum we have. And when you look at Brazil and the U.S. and the OECD, they are collaborating, and I think that's an important. But they have been for several decades, et cetera. But when I kind of look through the weeds even further and look at Brazil's interaction within OECD, one of the things, for example, that came up is how the OECD works, and the Tribunal de Contas, which is the federal accounting body in Brazil, have worked together on authoring papers on best practices for governance. That's, I think, key. And then if one has been following Brazil and the role of the TCU in Brazil in terms of helping improve transparency and public sector accounts, okay, at the federal level, and the increased institutional dialogue between the Treasury in Brazil and the TCU on best fiscal practices, et cetera. I think this kind of institutional strengthening is key. The benefits of that trickle in. In fact, the peer reviews from the OECD looking at Brazil's competition law, which then helps strengthen and inform a better competition law in Brazil. And under the competition law, that's also helped, again, with OECD in the corruption, its involvement on the various corruption committees, et cetera. Think about, yes, there has been significant corruption, very notable in the press, et cetera, but the architecture in Brazil has been tackling that. It'd be better if it wasn't there to begin with, but that said, the strengthening of certain governing bodies and processes, leniency agreements, et cetera, this has all come, I think, in part with under this the architecture of thinking of it GRP, better governance and better practices, and I think that's key.
Absolutely. Steve?
3 things. I mean, far be it from me in the private sector to tell the governments how to do their jobs, but we do have some suggestions, and maybe starting with the empty chair of USTR in the end. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Don't try and resolve every trade irritant don't try and resolve all your old business before you get on to some new business. What we're talking about in the new business will resolve some of the old business. Let's just not get fixated on it. And on the Brazil side, I would, following suggestions I've heard, take the 11 USMCA chapters, cut and paste them from PDF into Word, mark them up with track changes, send them back to USTR, see what sticks, and sign a deal by June.
Wow. We have our marching orders. And with that, I would like to open up for one or two questions. There should be a microphone coming your way.
I thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the Foreign Service. I'd like to follow up on some of the issues mentioned by our speakers. The Undersecretary and the Ambassador both mentioned the importance of infrastructure. One of our speakers just mentioned the problem of corruption, and Representative Lahood also mentioned that. Put those 2 elements both together, you get Odebrecht and that monumental scandal. I'd like to hear from some of our Brazilian representatives what the government of Brazil, what steps they've taken to put that issue behind us and to make sure anything like that does not happen again, whether with a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or some other measures. Thank you.
Perfect. Given that none of our Brazilian representatives are on stage right now, what I'll do is I'll encourage you to touch base with them right after the event. We do have quite a few representatives from the embassy here and others who might be able to talk on that. But if you'd like it.
I would just add one thing, saying a kind of a sister entity to GRP is good tendering practices. And the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank have a good set of international benchmark standards, again, international standards for public tendering. It's consistent with what we're talking about on GRP. That's a parallel effort that could be taken and I think would have fruits that would in that area.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions? No? Then with that, I'd like to thank our panelists so much, Lisa, and Stephen, for joining us today and for all of your support. And thank you again to the Embassy, to Apex, to the ambassadors who are here today for all of your partnership and work. And have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice.
I love that we were so coordinated.